So welcome to my talk. This is going to be about who wins Ethereum block building auctions. And the main question here is why. And we did this work together with Denning from Flashbots and Thomas from the Ethereum Foundation. So what we know is that MEV Boost, the PBS implementation that has been on since the merge, it's heavily used, and around like 90% of all blocks produced in Ethereum today comes from this mechanism. And what we also know is that there are some builders who are like better builders than the others, namely Titan, Rsync, and Beaver build, who in the time frame we analyzed, which is like from October 2023 to April 2024, built around 80% of all blocks. So what you see on the chart on the right is that on the y-axis, you see the total profits they made from the transaction fees and these coin-based transfers, like direct payments to the builders. And then on the x-axis, you see the profit margin. So like how much of the total fees coming in every block they keep as profits and how much of it they pay to the validators. And then the size of these scatters are like representing their market share. So the bigger the scatter point, the more market share they have. So you see that Beaver has the largest scatter, followed by Rsync, and then Titan comes. Well, what we also now know is that in this time frame we analyzed, in total 41 different block builders won this auction. And what you can see is that like the market share do not increase together with the profit margin. So there are some builders, like you can see I Can Has block or Thank You for a block, which has extremely high profit margins, although they have really small market share, like really small dots on the chart. And then you see some builders, you cannot really make the color, I guess, right now, but on the lower left side, like T-Builder, which are really unprofitable, like they are losing money every time they produce a block, yet they have like larger market share than those like more profitable guys. And the question we ask is like, okay, but like how does this happen? Like how can you make blocks and lose money, or how can you produce blocks, make money, but still have like really small market share compared to those like larger guys? And this is the point of the research that we do today. Like we try to understand how builders win the block auction and how they become profitable, because as you've seen, winning the auction doesn't mean you are making profits. So let's do a brief reminder about how the block auction works. And this is like super abstract, but what you will see is on the left-hand side, you'll see like a 12-second slot, and you'll see that bids are gonna start incoming. And on the right-hand side, you see a mempool, which is like where the transactions initially come. And yeah, let's see how this evolves over time. So first, some transactions come to the mempool of the builders. And what we know is that like builders bid something because they have a value for producing that block, and that value comes from the transactions that they included in those in that block. So we can think it as the, okay, when transactions come, that means value for us. But what we also know is that like the builders, they usually don't really just reflect all the value that they get from these transactions, and they have these other factors that they consider, which could be like their profit margins, at what point in time we are in the auction. So it could be that some builders say, okay, I'm not gonna reveal my hand right away, but I will wait at like maybe until T-2 or something. Some builders can say, okay, my total value is X, but I know that I cannot win this auction with just X value, so let me pay some more from my own pocket. And this is why we see those unprofitable builders who like win the market, but they don't do profits. And then they could also change their bid based on like what other people are bidding, because like why would I just pay all the value I have if people are like really bidding lower than me? And based on this, like we can think it as though like each builder has their own like internal bidding function, and all these factors go into it, and then they become like these reflected bids. And over time, what we know is that builders are going to receive more bids, they're going to observe others' bids, and they're going to continue updating their bids. So we see that more transactions come in, bid values go up, more transactions come in, bid values go up. And at some point, and let's assume the proposer is playing timing games, at t is equal to 2, he will say, okay, let me get the header. So the highest bid is then returned by the relayer, and the proposer signs this, and this becomes the block that we know that's added to the blockchain. And this is the block auction. And now like what we can think about is, okay, like transactions come in, but like I just wrote them as TX1, 2, 3, but ideally these are some transactions which actually serve some purpose. So to understand like how people win this auction, we need to really find what are these transactions. So yeah, we asked the question, which transactions bid for Ethereum block space today? And one thing we know is that like transactions, they don't have equal value for the senders. Like some transactions, which could be just sending some money from A to B, well, they're not really that like important for its sender regarding like at which block position it's included or how urgent it's included. So they won't really pay that much fee to get it included right away. Whereas some transactions, which could be like your sandwich or your centralized exchange, decentralized exchange arbitrage, they're really time sensitive, so they need high priority, so they would pay more fees. And we introduced this taxonomy, which like you don't really have to understand everything that's going on here right now. But the two things that really are critical is the first level of labels we introduce are transparency labels, which is like simply asking, okay, was this transaction seen in the public mempool or not? And we also have this OFA bundles as a third category there, because these order flow auction bundles, what happened there is that the user, they have a transaction and they submit it to this OFA. And what happens is the OFA then auctions this transaction for some searchers to like backrun it. So in one sense, the transaction skips the public mempool, the user transaction, but then in the other sense, it's also like exposed to some backrunners. So we consider that as a different category, although like maybe we can debate, it should be like exclusive signal. And then these labels, these are just like some meta labels for the transactions, but transactions have their own function, like what they serve. So those are the order flow labels. And there we have like the classic atomic MEV types, your sandwich liquidations, DEX-to-DEX arbitrage. We had a non-atomic MEV types, which we limited to centralized exchange, decentralized exchange. But we also know is that like a non-atomic MEV could be like a cross-chain arbitrage, so like say from ETH to Polygon, but we don't specifically detect those in this paper. Then you have these Telegram bot transactions, which are like transactions coming from these bots, which simply like do token sniping or some really like time-sensitive trading, and you'll see that they pay a lot of money for that. We have the solver model transactions, which are like your transactions coming from these protocols like CowSwap or Uniswap X, which are like filling orders for the users. The SEX deposits, so like the centralized exchange deposit transactions, we deem that as a different category. Then we have the swap flow, which is like any transaction which has a swap, but which is not belonging to these other categories. So like your classic retail swap, which is like if it's not sandwiched, or any transaction going to like a known router go into that retail swap category. And then bot swap is something like a transaction is going to a smart contract, which we don't know what the smart contract is doing, but the transaction does a swap. And you can think of this category as like long tail MEV strategies, which we cannot really identify what it is doing, but we know that there's a swap included in that. And then the final two are like the backruns of the OFA bundles and other public and exclusive transactions, which are like transactions that don't do any swap, but we also don't have any other label for that. So it could be like your classic ETH transfer, for example, or like a smart contract deployment, which doesn't do anything else. Okay, and like the main methodology we adopt is that we first decompose the MEV boost market based on initially the builder market, which is like more like an overview, then based on the order flow, and then finally identify builder strategies there. And this is more like a descriptive work. And then we use all of these as features, which we then try to find, okay, which one of these correlate with high profit margins and which one of those correlate with high market share. And also, we are working on some ML models to actually identify some features which like belong to certain builders. And these all matter because like these features will serve as like a handbook for how to become a builder, like how can you make profits or how can you earn market share, and these are not the same thing. And we think these will be useful for like developing the further iterations of PBS solutions. Okay, so let's start with the MEV boost decomposition, and I will show a bunch of charts here, and it may get a little confusing, so we can also talk afterwards. So the first thing we look is, as I said, and the colors don't look great, but let's first look at the builder market, and this is really trivial. Like you see the green, orange, and purple respectively represent Beaver, Rsync, and Titan. And on the right-hand side, you see the profits they make over time. So what you can see is that like almost consistently, they have like 80% of all blocks, the three of them. And we see that they make much more profits than the rest of the builders as well, except rsync, which we see that isn't as profitable as Titan and Beaver. So Titan and Beaver has like around $20 million profits in the 6-month period. But of course, like one thing we have to keep in mind is that these profits we calculate, yeah, I'm just coming to that. The profits we calculate is only the transaction fees, like the priority fees, and the Coinbase transfers. And the thing we need to keep in mind is that these builders, they're also potentially running their own searchers, which you can find in some other papers and also in this paper. And like if the builder is running his own searcher and the searcher is making profits, we are currently not including that in this chart. So this is purely Coinbase transfers and priority fees. And that's why like you can like think it as this as like a lower bound, although rsync probably has like much higher profits. But this is only the fees that we directly see coming from the transactions. Okay, so the next thing we look at is, as I showed you, we have the transparency labels initially. And the two prominent labels are the exclusive signal and the public signal. And the main takeaway here is that like around 66% of all block value, all fee value, come from exclusive transactions, which only take 19% of the block space. So you can think it as though like the users submit their valuable transactions exclusively, but this is really not much of the whole block. So block space is like the total gas available in block, and like the exclusive transactions only take 19% of it while providing more than half of the whole value. The next thing is, okay, so we understand how the transactions are distributed for that, but like how does builder's order flow look in terms of like how exclusive or not it is? And we only consider the top 10 builders here for brevity, but and the builders are ordered based on their market share. So Beaver Builder has the largest market share, and you see that like they have varying levels, but you can almost see that like as we see a larger market share, the value that comes from exclusive transactions also increase. And then on the right-hand side, what you see is, okay, like we define those order flow labels, and what % of them are actually submitted exclusively versus publicly. So you see that like most of them have like a single dominant type, although you see some atomic arbitrage or also not really often, but sometimes submitted publicly, etc. So that's again introducing some more features here. The next thing is, okay, we have seen the value coming from exclusive and public transactions, but of course, exclusive and public transactions have their order flow label on top. So this is like the value coming from the transaction types or order flow types we define. And you see, again, this is ordered based on how much value they bring. So Telegram bot flow on average brings the most value, followed by sandwich. And the key takeaway here is that Telegram bot flow, sandwich, and non-atomic arbitrage take up only 9% space while providing almost 50% of whole value. So this is, again, a pretty like valuable number showing that, okay, these transactions, they really like just take 10% of all block, but bring the most value. And again, you can see the builder's own order flow composition in terms of like what % of value comes from which transaction types. And you see like there is no single order flow type which really dominates these or is really dominating for these top 10 builders, although you can see like some small nuances. So for example, rsync and Beaver Build has this dark green bar more prominent, which is non-atomic arbitrage, whereas Titan has the Telegram bot flow more prominent. And if you look at all builders, you can see like a single order flow type really dominates. And like I can show you those charts if you want after the presentation as well. But yeah, we see that like all builders have their own like unique order flow composition profile. And what we see here is that like, I'm just showing it for the top 3 builders, but every bar here, it represents 1 week, and it's just showing the most prominent order flow label for that week and how much of the total value of the builder that label provides. So what we see is that like in the first 10 weeks or whatever, Telegram bot flow was like the most prominent for all three builders. But then each builder has its own like changing prominent order flow. So rsync had more value coming from non-atomic arbitrage, whereas Beaver had sandwich. And like one thing maybe you can keep on mind right now is that the ceiling is not really high regardless of like which order flow type is providing value. So it's like almost 30% maximum, around 20 to 30 usually % of the total value is coming from an order flow label. And what you will see in the following, one of the following slides is that when we look into the smaller builders, the ceiling is much more higher, because when you think about it, these smaller builders, like it could be like a searcher builder, which like is really good at getting one order flow type, but really doesn't have any other order flow. So like maybe they get 80% of their all value from a single transaction type. And these larger builders, because they are good at getting like different order flows, they don't have really like a one order flow which really peaks. And yeah, I will show you some results about this at the end. So much about the order flow types now. And now let's try to like look at some builder strategies. So on the left-hand side, what you see is the block packing strategy. So by block packing, what we mean is that how much of the value comes from the top of the block, the body of the block, and end of the block. And we define top of the block and end of the block as like top 10% transaction index-wise, bottom 10%, and the remaining 8%. And what you can see is that top 10% usually brings the most value for all builders. And some builders, such as Titan, Gambit Labs, and Penguin, also has value coming from end of the block. So like how to interpret this is that these guys also have transactions which pay good money at the end of their block positions, as opposed to like the general intuition that like if I have a valuable transaction, it should go at the top of the block. And I leave it to you why this might happen. And then on the right-hand side, what you can see is some latency and bidding behavior. So we measured this only on the ultrasound relay, so it could be biased on that. And what we'll look at is like, okay, how many blocks did they win on ultrasound? How many bids did they place per each block that they have won? And then what was their fastest update? So like what was the minimal time between two bids that they placed? And the way to read this is like you can think it as like, okay, there's a server which like continuously places bids, and for let's say Beaver, there were only like 8 milliseconds in between. But this is not exactly what happens. What could also happen is that Beaver could run multiple public keys, which are like continuously updating bids, and like maybe like one public key submitted a bid, and then the other public key just submitted one 8 milliseconds after, and that's why like it looks like there is only 8 milliseconds between the two bids. But it's not that because like a single server is updating bids this fast. It could be that like multiple like servers that Beaver controls updates the bid, but because they all belong to Beaver, we see it as though like Beaver can update bids this fast. And the last column you see is the cancellation. So a cancellation is simply like if I have a bid, and now if I want to like decrease its value, like update my latest bid, then I submit like a new bid which has a lower value, and we call it a cancellation because now like the proposer cannot access my highest bid, or like the higher value bid, so I canceled it. And this is a useful strategy for those sextex like arbitrageurs or searchers or builders, because like depending on how the price changed on the sex, they can simply like update their bids. And we see again that like Beaver, rsync, and Titan has more than one cancellation on average per block, whereas other guys, like for other guys, this is lower. But again, if we look at the long tail of builders, there are some builders which are just like running their own centralized exchange, decentralized exchange arbitrageurs, and they actually have quite high numbers of cancellations. And then the final two strategies we look into is their subsidy profile. So the yellow bar represents the percentage of blocks that these top builders subsidized. The light blue is like the ones that they didn't take any profits or like had dust profits. And then the dark blue is like the profitable ones. And you can again see some quite diverse profiles here, like T-Builder, the guy we saw on the bottom left in the first chart, is almost always subsidizing, whereas like more prominent builders like Beaver or rsync or Titan, they more often take profits. And on the right-hand side, Flashbots and Gambit, for example, they never subsidize. And then on the right-hand side, what we see is like exclusive order flow, but it's morely about exclusive order flow acquisition, because we talked about like, okay, which transaction types come exclusively. But of course, if a transaction is coming exclusively, it has to be submitted by someone exclusively. So you need to have a deal with that provider. And like these providers, they could be like the searchers that we know of. They could be like solvers of these solver models like CowSwap, or they could be Telegram bots. And like for Telegram bots, they're usually like only Banana Gun and Maestro that we consider. But for example, you can see like the top 10 builders and their like searcher flow coming, and you can see Jared from Subway usually provides the most value. But for rsync and Beaver, you can see some other guys who also provide most value. Or like for T-Builder, again, you see the searcher one guy. And again, these relations become much more prominent when we look into like the long tail of builders, because they usually have like a designated searcher that they run. Okay, so much of like these descriptions. So the idea here was, Denning, am I over time? Okay, I'm closing it up. So we identified the futures, and this is still like ongoing work, but now we want to assess, okay, which ones of these are prominent for earning market share, and which one of those are prominent for like making profits, and also can we identify some futures which really like belong to a certain builder. So here you see the futures which are correlated with the market share of the top builders, and like you can like see, for example, from the order flow types, non-atomic arbitrage, liquidations, and Uniswap X flow belong to those like higher market share builders, whereas builders who don't have much market share, something like T-Builder, they get value from like public flow, for example, or they get value from body of the block positions and not so much from top of the block. And again, cancellations kind of belong to those, again, more successful builders. And then, yeah, this was the thing that I was talking about, the trends. So what you see here is that on the left-hand side, you see the same chart that I showed, but on the monthly basis for the top 20 builders. So like which order flow brings the most value and how prominent it is. And you see that from the right-hand side is the most successful builder. As we go from right to left, the prominence of the order flow also increases, which means that those builders who have like smaller market share, they usually have a really dominant order flow, which brings the most value. And there is actually a positive correlation, which like also like confirms this. As the market share increases, the order flow composition entropy, like how diverse is the order flow of the builder, also increases. And finally, these are the order flow or like futures which are positively correlated with profit margin. So exclusive signal is like the most prominent one there. So as your transactions are more exclusive, you don't really need to reflect all the value that comes from them because they are exclusive to you, ideally. And that's like the most prominent correlated one. And if you have transactions which are coming from like these sexes or public signal, well, they're really not that profitable, and they have like significant negative correlations. And these are the key contributions and takeaways. Right now, we're still working on the ML part to identify the futures which are like tied to certain builders. And hopefully, we will submit a full paper version of this next week to AFT. And yeah, that's, I think, all for now. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks. Let's take one question. Anybody? If not, I have a question. So what is the machine learning method you're talking about? That?
Yeah. So we're using linear discriminant analysis to really just look for futures and their decoding accuracy for the builders. So like if, let's say there is a searcher which only sends their transactions to a single builder, well then the decoding accuracy of that like searcher for that builder should be really high, because like we can right away identify, okay, this searcher flow belongs to this builder, and that way like we can identify these like vertical integrations, or we can more clearly answer like how do you win the auction, or which builders win because of why, or like because of which features. And yeah, so that's the idea there. But yeah, it's not over yet, so I don't want to present the results yet.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks for the talk again. Next, I'll hand it over to Sarah for the governance session.